The neighborhood always looked peaceful from the outside. Neatly cut lawns, clean driveways, and houses that seemed almost the same. But behind that perfect picture, something darker was slowly spreading. It began with a letter. Not a friendly note, not even a warning with reason, but a command. The HOA had spoken. New rules, strange ones. Rules no one had voted for. Rules that made neighbors whisper to each other in low voices late at night. "Did you get one too?" they asked. "Yes. I don't even know what I did wrong." The letters came in plain white envelopes, stamped with the HOA seal. Inside, the words felt heavy, almost threatening. Homeowners were told they were breaking rules they had never even heard of. Fines were listed, deadlines set. And if they failed to obey, stronger punishments would follow. At first, people thought it was a mistake. But then another wave of letters arrived. Some were slipped under doors in the middle of the night. Others came with official warnings, hinting at legal action. It was as if the HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood anymore. It was controlling it. Fear began to spread. Neighbors stopped talking openly. They kept their curtains closed. They avoided gatherings in front yards, afraid that the wrong word might be reported. The streets grew quieter. But there was something more, something no one could see. Behind the HOA's sudden power was a secret. Meetings held without notice, rules created in silence, leaders whispering behind closed doors. The board acted as if they owned everything, as if they could decide the future of every family on that street. And yet no one knew the truth. No one knew why the HOA had suddenly become so aggressive. Was it about money? Control? Or was it something bigger? Something hidden deep inside the fine print of their bylaws? One thing was certain. They wanted to show power, to remind everyone who was in charge, and they were willing to do anything to prove it. But in every story of control, there is always someone who refuses to bend, someone who asks the question no one else dares to ask. And in this quiet neighborhood, that someone was about to rise. Because while the HOA thought their power was unshakable, one homeowner was already watching, already listening, already planning. The board didn't know it yet, but the game they had started was about to turn. The night was still. The houses stood silent. The rules were written, the threats delivered. But in the shadows of this perfect street, a fight for truth was waiting to begin. And soon, the HOA would learn that their greatest weapon would also become their biggest mistake. The first real strike came quietly. It was a morning like any other when Mark stepped onto his porch. The sun was rising, the air was calm, and the world felt normal. But waiting on his doorstep was an envelope with the HOA's seal. He picked it up, confused. He had never been in trouble before. His lawn was neat, his house painted, his car always parked in the right spot. What could this be about? When he opened it, the words made his hands tighten. "You are in violation of HOA standards. Immediate correction required." There was no explanation, no photo, no detail. Just a rule number he didn't recognize and a threat of a fine if he didn't fix the problem within 7 days. Mark read it again. Violation? What violation? Later that day, he found out he wasn't alone. His neighbor Claire had received one too. Hers claimed her mailbox was non-compliant. Another man down the street, Mr. Rivera, was told his curtains were unapproved. It was strange. These were not rules anyone remembered voting for. In fact, no one could recall ever hearing about them. And yet the letters kept coming. Some neighbors got more than one. Each was written in the same cold, commanding tone, as if the board was speaking from above, untouchable. The neighborhood that once felt safe now carried an invisible weight. People looked at their homes with suspicion, wondering what the HOA would target next. Mark tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe if he ignored it, it would go away. But deep down, something told him this was only the beginning. Because the HOA wasn't just making rules anymore, they were testing obedience. And Mark had just been chosen as one of their first targets.
1. Claire's second letter warned that her mailbox could lead to enforcement measures. Mr. Rivera was told his curtains could bring a daily fine until he replaced them. The HOA wasn't just reminding people of rules, it was attacking them, one by one. Neighbors grew nervous. Some gave in quickly, rushing to change things they didn't even believe were wrong. Mailboxes were painted overnight. Perfectly good curtains were torn down and replaced. People were spending money just to avoid trouble. But Mark couldn't shake the question. Why now? The board had always been strict, but never like this. Now, it felt like they were flexing their power, pushing the community to see how far they could go. One evening, Mark overheard 2 board members talking near the community hall. Their voices were low, but the words were sharp. They'll fall in line. No one's going to fight us. The meaning was clear. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. That night, as the street grew dark and quiet, Mark sat at his desk with both letters in front of him. The more he read them, the angrier he felt. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood anymore. They were testing it, and they were daring anyone to resist. Mark didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the one person who wouldn't stay silent. Mark couldn't sleep. The second letter from the HOA still sat on his desk, its sharp black letters almost glowing under the dim light. Every time he read the words, he felt the same heavy pressure in his chest. The board wasn't asking him to follow a rule. They were daring him to fight back. But something inside Mark wouldn't let him just obey. He needed to know the truth. The next morning, while most of his neighbors rushed to fix their homes to avoid punishment, Mark decided to do the opposite. He wanted to see if the HOA was even allowed to do this. He started small. He pulled out the original HOA handbook that every homeowner received when they moved into the neighborhood. He flipped through the pages slowly, searching for the rule number listed in his letter. Page after page. Nothing. The rule they accused him of breaking didn't even exist. His heart raced. If it wasn't in the handbook, then where did it come from? Later that day, Mark walked over to Claire's house. She was standing on her porch, staring angrily at her freshly painted mailbox. "They made you change it already?" Mark asked. Claire sighed. "I didn't have a choice. They said they'd fine me every day until it was repainted. I can't afford that right now." Mark pulled out his letter. "Look at this. Do you see this rule number here? Can you find it in your handbook?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Mine didn't match anything either. I thought maybe I was missing pages." The two of them exchanged a worried glance. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about something hidden, something the HOA didn't want them to question. That night, Mark decided to push further. He went to the small community library inside the clubhouse, where HOA meeting records were supposed to be stored. He expected to find thick binders with minutes from board meetings, votes, and changes to the bylaws. But when he opened the cabinet drawers, most of the binders were missing. Only a few remained, and many pages were torn out. Some years were completely gone, as if they had never existed. He pulled one binder closer and flipped through it. The language was vague, the notes rushed. Whole sections were blacked out with permanent marker. His stomach tightened. Someone had erased the history of this HOA. While he was still inside, he heard voices outside the door. Quick, hushed voices. The board members. He's starting to ask questions. "Don't worry.
We'll make an example out of him." Mark froze. They were talking about him. He stayed still until the voices faded. Then he slipped out the back, his heart pounding as he made his way home in the dark. The night air felt colder now. The neighborhood, once familiar, now felt like a trap. The next morning, Mark gathered with a small group of neighbors who also felt uneasy about the new rules. Claire was there. Mr. Rivera, too. Each of them held letters from the HOA, each more threatening than the last. "Something isn't right," Mark told them. "The rules they're enforcing aren't in the handbook. And the meeting records? They've been erased. Someone doesn't want us to know the truth." The group listened in silence, fear in their eyes. For years they had trusted the HOA, believing it was there to protect their homes and their community. But now, it seemed like the very people who were supposed to serve them were hiding behind shadows. "Then what do we do?" Claire whispered. Mark looked at them all, his voice firm. "We find the missing pieces. We dig until we uncover what they're hiding. If we don't, they'll keep taking more power until there's nothing left." That was the night the quiet whispers of fear turned into something else. Resolve. The HOA thought the neighbors would stay quiet, too afraid to fight back. But Mark had play. It had a seed. And once the truth began to surface, nothing could stop it, because the board's power was built on silence. And Mark had just broken it. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. A handful of board members at a long table, neighbors half listening, and nothing unusual. But this time, the room was packed. Word of the missing records and fake rules had spread, and curiosity turned into quiet defiance. By 7 o'clock, the clubhouse was full. Folding chairs lined the walls, and people stood in the back. The board members hadn't expected such a crowd. Mark sat near the front, the 2 warning letters folded in his hand. His pulse raced, but his decision was firm. He would speak. The president began with a polished speech about new clarifications. But before he could continue, Mark stood up. "Excuse me," he said clearly. "Before you go on, I need to ask something." The president frowned. "This isn't the time for questions. Please sit." But Mark held his ground. "It is the time. These letters accuse me of violating rules that don't even exist in the handbook. I checked, and I'm not the only one." A ripple spread through the room. Neighbors nodded, whispering to each other. The president's voice sharpened. "You must be mistaken." Mark lifted the letters higher. "I'm not. And when I searched the meeting records, whole years were missing. Some pages blacked out. That's not a mistake. It's deliberate." Gasps filled the room. Claire stood. "He's telling the truth. My mailbox rule wasn't in the handbook either." Another neighbor shouted, "Neither was mine. You're inventing rules to scare us." The board shifted uneasily. The vice president leaned forward. "The board has authority to clarify rules. That's what everyone agreed to when signing the HOA contract." Mark's reply cut sharp. "Authority doesn't mean secrecy. If these were real changes, there would be votes and records. Where are they?" The room erupted. Dozens of voices rose at once, angry, demanding, no longer afraid. The president slammed his hand on the table. "Order! Order!" The crowd quieted, but the air was electric. Mark stepped closer. "You've used threats to control us. Letters, fines, intimidation. But tonight we're not silent. Tonight, we want the truth." The board froze. The president forced a thin smile. "You don't know what you're talking about. This meeting is over." He gathered his papers. But before he could leave, neighbors stood and blocked the exit. Their eyes burned with anger and resolve. For the first time, the board realized their grip was slipping. The meeting they thought they controlled had turned against them. Mark didn't have every answer yet, but he had shifted the balance. The community wasn't afraid anymore.
The board could silence individuals, but not everyone. Still, Mark knew it wasn't finished. The board wouldn't surrender. They would fight harder. And if he wanted to win, he would need undeniable proof. And that proof was still hidden in the shadows. The clubhouse meeting had ended in chaos, but the effect was lasting. The neighborhood no longer felt quiet and submissive. Neighbors lingered outside longer, spoke in hushed voices about what they'd heard, and began questioning things they had once accepted without a second thought. For Mark, the anger hadn't faded. It burned hotter. He knew exposing the missing rules in public was important, but suspicion wasn't enough. The board could still twist his words, dismiss the crowd's reaction, or label everything confusion. He needed something stronger. He needed proof. That night, his dining table became a war room. He spread out the HOA handbook, newsletters, old emails, and the 2 violation letters. He read each one carefully, tracing patterns. That's when he noticed something subtle but undeniable. The rule numbers in the letters didn't match the format of the handbook. It was a small detail, but it screamed forgery. The next day, Mark returned to the clubhouse. The records room was quiet, with no one watching. He pulled open the drawers again, searching. Most of the binders were still stripped, their pages missing. But in the back, shoved behind dusty folders, he found loose papers that hadn't been destroyed. His heart pounded as he read them. Proposed rule expansion. No public vote required if categorized as safety. Increased fines, higher community revenue. Most members unlikely to resist. Fear equals compliance. The handwriting was rushed, almost careless, but the meaning was chilling. The HOA board had been deliberately creating rules outside the bylaws, hiding them under the label of safety and using fines as a way to generate money. But there was more. At the bottom of the page, Mark saw a name, Grant Development Corp. His stomach tightened. Grant was the same developer who had built the neighborhood years ago. Why would their name still appear in board notes long after construction ended? He dug deeper, flipping through more pages. Then he found it. A typed agreement. Partnership agreement. Board ensures compliance with stricter standards. In return, developer provides financial incentives for continued operations. Mark froze. The HOA wasn't acting alone. The board was still tied to the developer. Every fine, every rule, every threat brought more money not just to the HOA, but to a corporate partner. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe or pretty. It was about control and profit. Mark stuffed the papers into a folder and left quickly, his pulse racing. On the way home, he stopped at Claire's house. He spread the evidence across her table. Claire's face turned pale. They're not just breaking the rules. They're working with a corporation. This is corruption. Mr. Rivera joined them, shaking his head in disbelief. All this time we thought the HOA was overzealous. But this is calculated. They're exploiting us. The group sat in silence as the truth sank in. For years they had trusted the board to act in the community's interest. But instead, the board had been feeding a deal that gave them power and profit, while stripping the neighborhood of its freedom. Mark looked at them all. This changes everything. If the rest of the neighbors see this, they'll know we weren't paranoid. They'll know the board has been lying to us. Claire leaned forward. Then we show them. We can't let this stay hidden. Mark nodded, though a cold weight sat in his chest. He knew the board wouldn't let this exposure happen quietly. They had too much to lose. Still, the decision was made. The truth would be revealed. For years, the board had believed their secrets were safe, buried in missing records and erased pages. But Mark had broken through the cracks. And once the light touched the hidden teal, Ruth, there would be no going back.
The next HOA meeting was different from the last. The board thought the uproar from before had died down, but they were wrong. This time, the neighbors didn't just come to watch, they came ready. Word had spread about Mark's discovery. Not everyone believed it, but curiosity was stronger than fear. By the time the clock struck 7, the clubhouse was packed again. Folding chairs filled every corner, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The hum of whispers filled the air like static before a storm. At the front, the board members shuffled their papers, their smiles tight, their voices low. They were nervous, though they tried to hide it. Mark sat near the aisle, a thick folder in his lap. Inside were the papers he had found, draft notes, agreements, and proof of the board's partnership with Grant Development Corp. His hand rested on it like a weapon. He knew this was his moment. The president began with his usual tone of control. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight's agenda includes—" Mark stood before the man could finish. His voice was steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Before you list another so-called agenda, we need answers. And tonight, you won't silence us." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. The president scowled. "You again. We've already explained." Mark raised his voice. "No, you haven't. You've hidden. You've erased records. And you've invented rules. But now I have proof." He opened the folder and held up a page, his words sharp and clear. "This is a handwritten note from your own files. It says, and I quote, 'Increase fines is higher community revenue.'" The room erupted. Voices shouted. Chairs scraped. People leaned forward, their eyes locked on the board. Mark lifted another page. "And here's the real truth. A typed agreement between this board and Grant Development Corp. You've been enforcing fake rules to squeeze money out of us. And in return you've been rewarded financially. That's why the records are missing. That's why you've silenced questions. You're not protecting the community. You're exploiting it." The crowd exploded. "Is this true?" someone shouted. "How could you?" another cried. Fear turned into fury. The board members paled. The vice president stammered, These documents are being taken out of context." Mark cut him off. "Context? It says right here, partnership agreement. It says, no public vote required if categorized as safety. You've been manipulating the bylaws, hiding behind legal words and stealing from us all. That's not context. That's corruption." The room thundered with anger. Neighbors stood, fists clenched, voices rising together. For years they had been controlled by silence, but now the silence was broken. The president slammed his gavel, his voice cracking. "Enough! This is slander! This meeting is adjourned!" He tried to leave, but the crowd surged forward. People blocked the exit, their faces burning with rage. For the first time, the board couldn't simply walk away. Claire stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We trusted you. We paid our dues. We followed your rules. And all this time you were lying to us. We deserve better. This community deserves better." The board looked trapped, cornered by the very people they thought they controlled. Their power had always come from fear and secrecy. But now the truth was out, laid bare for everyone to see. Mark stood taller. "You wanted to show power, but power built on lies always falls. Tonight, the neighborhood sees you for what you are." The room roared with approval. The board had no defense, no escape. Their empire of control was crumbling right in front of them. And though Mark knew the fight wasn't fully over, there would be legal battles, more arguments, maybe even retaliation. He also knew one thing for certain. The board's mask had been ripped away. The HOA had tried to flex its power, but now they were exposed. The clubhouse had never felt so alive. The board members sat frozen at their table, their faces pale, while the neighbors they once controlled stood tall and unafraid. The evidence was out. The whispers were over. But exposure was only the beginning. The following days were a storm. News of the meeting spread faster than anyone expected. Neighbors who hadn't attended heard everything about the forged rules, the erased records, and the secret deal with Grant Development Corp. Copies of the documents circulated through email and printed flyers slipped into mailboxes. What the board had tried to keep hidden was now in every hand. For the first time in years, the neighborhood didn't feel divided by fear. Families gathered in front yards again, talking openly, planning, imagining a future without intimidation. Even those who had once supported the board began to turn away, unable to deny the truth in front of them. The board, however, didn't give up quietly. The president issued a statement calling Mark's evidence incomplete and misinterpreted. They tried to send more letters, warning homeowners that fines were still valid. But now, the letters carried no weight. People laughed at them, tore them up, and posted them on bulletin boards as reminders of how far the board had fallen. The neighbors organized. Claire, Rivera, and several others formed a committee, separate from the board, dedicated to reviewing the bylaws and protecting the community from further abuse. They called meetings in open yards, where everyone was invited and nothing was hidden. Attendance grew with every gathering. Mark, though reluctant to be the center of attention, became a symbol. People thanked him when he walked by, shook his hand, and told him he had given them courage. He always answered the same way. It wasn't just me. It was all of us, standing together. Still, he couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. The board still had legal standing, at least on paper. Removing them completely would require a vote, maybe even lawyers. And the deal with the developer, Grant Development Corp., wasn't gone just because it was exposed. Corporations rarely walked away quietly. But something more powerful than contracts had changed. The people. For years, fear had been the board's greatest weapon. They had relied on silence, on neighbors obeying without question. That power was broken now. Even if the board tried to fight back, they would face a community that had woken up. Weeks later, another meeting was held, this time called by the residents, not the board. The turnout was overwhelming. Families filled the clubhouse, the parking lot, even the sidewalks outside. One by one, neighbors stood and voted. The board was removed. New leaders were chosen, ones who promised transparency and fairness. The old board members left quietly, avoiding the stares of the people they had once ruled over. Their attempt to show power had ended in humiliation. The aftermath wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still challenges ahead. Rebuilding trust would take time. But the difference was clear. The community was no longer living in fear. Children played in yards again. Neighbors waved without hesitation. Meetings became open discussions instead of lectures. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not the board who tried to control it. As Mark walked home one evening, he paused at his mailbox. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the street. He thought about the first letter, the threat, the confusion, the anger. It felt like a lifetime ago. The HOA had wanted to show power. They wanted obedience, control, and silence. But instead, they had been exposed. And once the truth was out, there was no going back. The neighborhood was free. And it was a freedom no board could ever take again.